The barn loomed like a forgotten god, its timber ribs sagging under decades of neglect, the paint peeled in long, ragged strips, revealing splintered wood that had weathered more storms than any man could count. A cracked stone chimney stood sentinel on the roof, its mortar crumbling into dust, as if it too were tired of holding up a false sanctuary. Charles stepped inside with a deliberate quiet. He did not speak. He did not breathe loudly. The air smelled of damp earth and old hay, mingled with the metallic tang of rusted nails. Each footfall on the creaking floorboards was a soft percussion against the silence that had become his companion. He moved through the space like a ghost, touching the warped beams, feeling their coldness seep into his fingers. The barn's walls were not merely structures, they were silent witnesses to abandonment, each splinter and crack holding stories of neglect that matched the hollowness in Charles's chest. He chose silence over conversation, routine over revelation. He set a small fire in the old stove, letting the flames lick the corners of the room while he watched them dance without turning his head toward the darkness beyond. He pulled out a worn notebook from his bag and began to write. Only letters on paper, no words spoken aloud. The rhythm of scratching his pen became a metronome for his solitude, each line a step deeper into isolation. The choice to maintain silence was not born of cowardice, but of survival. Charles had learned that speaking in this place would invite the memories he tried so hard to bury. The hiss of the wind through broken windows, the echo of a siren that once pierced his nights, the ghostly outline of an ex-partner's shadow. By keeping his voice low, by refusing to let words mingle with the creaking beams, he kept the barn, and himself, contained within its fragile walls. Yet this containment was not protection, it was compounding. The more he clung to routine, the tighter the isolation wrapped around him like ivy. Each night he would hear the wind rattling broken panes, and the sound seemed less a breeze than an accusation. The cracked chimney, once a mere architectural flaw, became a symbol of his own fractured heart, an opening through which cold shame seeped in. As dusk fell, the fields outside grew shrouded in a thick grey haze. Tall grass swayed like restless bodies, and wildflowers, though few, clung stubbornly to life. The wind carried a faint scent of rain that never came, a promise unkept, mirroring Charles's own promises to himself. In this quiet, the barn became a mirror. Its walls reflected not only his physical form, but also the echoing hollowness of his past. He could have opened the door and stepped into the world beyond, but he stayed behind the threshold of silence, letting the crumbling structure swallow him whole. Would this steadfast retreat from sound truly shield him from the storm that raged inside? The wind had settled into an uneasy hush over Hollow Creek Barn, its old boards sighing under the weight of a sudden chill that seemed to seep from the cracked stone chimney itself. A lone beam, long ago rotted and weakened by years of neglect, rattled against the rafters as if in protest. In the dim light filtered through broken panes, Charles stood alone, his back pressed to the rough wood of the outer wall, hands resting on a weathered ledger he had begun to write but never finished. A siren cut through the silence, a distant wail that seemed to echo from another world, its mournful cry rising and falling like a slow heartbeat. The sound was not a call for help or an alarm, it was a summons from the past, a reminder of the violence that had once shadowed his steps. The memory it evoked was sharp as a splinter, the flash of a gun, the hiss of threats spoken in a voice that had become part of his own echo chamber. He felt the old ache in his chest tighten, a pressure that pressed against his ribs like a stone. Charles closed his eyes for an instant, breathing out a breath that carried with it the weight of years spent holding on to silence. The siren continued its mournful drone, each note a reminder that the past was never truly gone. It merely waited to be awakened by something as simple as wind through a broken window. He could have turned back, could have fled to the nearest town and buried his thoughts deeper under the weight of anonymity. Yet he did not. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the cracked ceiling. where dust motes hung like fleeting ghosts in the sliver of light that pierced the barn's wounds. The sound, though distant, seemed to grow louder in the quiet, a relentless reminder that the past was an ever-present shadow. He chose to ignore it, a deliberate act of defiance against the memory that threatened to swallow him whole. His fingers tightened around the ledger, as if gripping onto something vital. The choice he made was not one born of bravery, but of necessity. To keep moving forward, to continue writing, to keep his hands busy with ink and paper, rather than allowing the siren's call to consume his mind entirely. Each stroke of the pen felt like a small rebellion against the terror that lurked just beyond the barn's crumbling walls. Yet the consequence of this choice settled into him as a cold stone. The unresolved trauma, once dormant in the recesses of his heart, tightened its grip with renewed vigor. It clung to him like ivy around a broken beam, tightening with every step he took within the sanctuary of decay. He could feel it, the weight pressing down on his chest, the sudden pangs that flared up when the siren's echo lingered in the corners of his mind. The barn seemed to close in around him, as if it were aware of the battle waged within. The wood creaked, a low groan that matched the rhythm of his heart, while the wind outside rattled broken windows like glass shards against a storm. In the dim glow, he could see the faint outline of a beam that had once supported the roof, now barely holding its place in the skeletal structure. Charles turned back to his writing, but his hand trembled with an unfamiliar nervousness. The ink bled onto paper, as if it too were trying to escape from somewhere deep inside him. He wrote sentences that felt like prayers, each word a plea for release from the siren's haunting echo. Yet every line he penned only seemed to deepen the void within, a reminder that silence was not a cure, but a cage. The siren's wail grew louder, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to pound against his resolve. He could feel the edges of his sanity fraying, the sense of self dissolving into the past each time he let the memory seep through his thoughts. The unresolved trauma tightened its grip on his heart like a vice, squeezing tighter with every heartbeat. In the darkness that shrouded the barn's interior, the only light came from the flickering flame of a small lantern he had set up to keep the chill at bay. Its glow cast long shadows across the walls, painting the decaying structure in an almost surreal chiaroscuro. The sight was both haunting and beautiful, a testament to his stubborn determination to survive within these walls. The siren's cry reached its peak, then faded into a distant wail that seemed to echo from another lifetime. Charles felt the weight of it, lingering like a storm cloud over his head. He knew that this moment, this choice to ignore the memory and press on, would not erase the past, but only make it more insistent. He closed his eyes once again, inhaling deeply, as if trying to draw in peace from the air around him. Yet the wind outside seemed to carry a new sound, a low, guttural growl that matched the rhythm of his racing heart. The barn's structure groaned, its beams shifting under the strain of time and memory alike. The unresolved trauma, now tightened like a noose around his chest, whispered in his mind, "You cannot escape what you have buried." He felt the words echoing through every creak and crack, each one a reminder that he was trapped, not just by the barn's physical decay, but also by the emotional rot that had taken root within him. As the siren finally faded into nothingness, Charles opened his eyes to find himself staring at the cracked stone chimney, its once strong facade now a crumbling testament to time. He could feel the cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls, each gust of wind a reminder that he was not alone. Yet the solitude remained as thick and unyielding as the barn's timber. The consequence of his choice lingered like a shadow. The unresolved trauma tightened its grip on his heart, a relentless pressure that would only grow stronger if he did not confront it. The barn, with all its false refuge, seemed to mock him with its fragile promise of safety. In this moment, as the wind howled outside and the siren's echo faded into silence, Charles was left with one stark question. Could a man truly outrun his own past? The wind had been a low, mournful moan for hours, rattling the broken windows like an old man's sighs against a crumbling house. In that breathless hush, a sudden gust, more fierce than any before, pushed against the sagging beam that had leaned against the cracked stone chimney. Wood groaned, splintered, and then, with a sound that seemed to split the very air, a section of the beam shattered free. A sliver of light slipped through the jagged opening, casting an uneven shadow across the floorboards. In that fleeting glimmer, something moved, an indistinct shape trembling against the cold wooden wall. It was a presence, not yet fully visible, as if the barn itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next echo to stir. The silence that followed felt thicker than any storm. Charles stood frozen, his fingers still gripping the worn edge of his notebook, his heart hammered against his ribs like a drum in an abandoned chapel. He had built this place into a sanctuary, but it was now a cage of its own making. The beam's sudden fall was a cruel reminder that even the strongest structures can give way under pressure. He felt the weight of every memory he had tried to bury in these walls, each scar, each whispered threat from the past, piling like dust on his shoulders. The wind outside seemed to mimic the relentless ache inside him, swirling around the barn's bones and carrying with it a distant siren that never quite faded. In that moment, the choice that lay before him was as stark as the cracked plaster: step forward into the dim glow of uncertainty, or retreat deeper into the hollow silence he had cultivated. The presence within the beam's shadow beckoned him, not with words, but with the raw, trembling pulse of a life caught in a storm. He hesitated, his mind racing through every fear that had led him to this place. Yet something deep inside, perhaps the faintest ember of hope or a stubborn defiance born from years of surviving, ignited a spark. With a breath that seemed both surrender and resolve, he stepped toward the figure. The barn's quiet shattered in a sudden rush of sound: the creak of settling wood, the scrape of his boots on rough floorboards, the low murmur of the wind as it slipped through the broken walls. The air felt charged, as if every breath he took was now part of a larger, unseen dialogue. The presence, still shrouded in shadow, seemed to pause, its tremble slowing, its shape becoming clearer with each step Charles took. The barn's isolation, once a fortress against the world, dissolved into an open space where the past and present collided. The walls that had kept him apart now crumbled under the weight of his movement, leaving him exposed. In that instant, as the light flickered across the trembling figure, Charles realized the fragile solitude he had clung to was nothing more than a veneer over a deeper, unspoken truth. Isolation could no longer shield him from the storms within. The consequence was clear: he would have to confront whatever lay beyond the barn's decaying walls, or risk being swallowed by the very silence that had once offered refuge. Would stepping into that trembling darkness be the first true act of facing his own past? The wind had already begun to howl through the broken windows of Hollow Creek Barn when the first silhouette slipped into view. A lone figure, tall and gaunt, stepped out from behind a cluster of twisted vines that clung to the sagging beams like desperate hands. He was Marcus Vale, the developer, his coat stiff with the dust of another town's progress, his eyes cold as the steel he carried in his pocket. He moved without sound, his boots barely disturbing the dry grass that pressed against the cracked stone chimney. The barn's peeling paint seemed to recoil from him, as if it sensed the threat he posed. Marcus paused before the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the interior with a predator's patience. He was not here for conversation. He had come to survey what he could claim as his future. His men, clad in workwear, their faces shadowed by hard hats, followed him like a swarm of ants, each step measured and deliberate. From a hidden corner beneath the sagging roof, Charles watched them with eyes that burned brighter than the flame on his stove. He had spent nights in this very space, turning pages into talismans against the siren's call that still lingered in the cracked walls. Now, with Marcus Vale's presence, the air felt thicker, the silence louder. Marcus raised a hand, not to strike, but to command. The men shifted their weight, aligning themselves as if to form an invisible barricade between him and whatever lay beyond the barn's threshold. He spoke in a low voice that carried over the wind. "This place is on the market. I intend to renovate it." The words hung like a threat, cutting through the already strained atmosphere. Charles felt his chest tighten as if a fist had closed around his ribs. The men moved closer, their boots crunching on the wooden floorboards that had seen better days. Charles's choice was clear. He could step forward, confront Marcus, and demand that he leave this place untouched, or he could retreat to the safety of his hidden corner and let the inevitable unfold. He chose silence. In the stillness of the barn, his heartbeat sounded like a drumbeat against the walls, each thump echoing the fear that gnawed at his resolve. The consequence came in the form of Marcus's gaze tightening on Charles, as if he could see through the very dust motes that floated in the air. The men shifted again, aligning themselves around the barn's central space, creating a perimeter that made the structure feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, rattling the broken windows like a chorus of warning bells. Charles could hear his own breathing now, heavy and shallow, matching the rhythmic creak of the beams as they groaned under the weight of their own decay. He felt the barn's structure as if it were a living thing, its walls pressing against him, its roof sagging like a wounded animal. The sense that he was trapped in an environment designed to deceive, seeming safe, yet structurally unsound, was undeniable. Marcus Vale stepped closer still, his presence a physical weight on the air. He leaned against the cracked stone chimney, as if drawing strength from the very thing that could collapse at any moment. His eyes flicked over Charles again, a silent judgment passing between them. The men behind him shifted their posture, forming an invisible barrier around the barn's interior, leaving no escape route for anyone who might wish to leave. Charles felt the urge to run, an instinctive drive to flee from this looming danger, but his feet were rooted to the dusty floorboards. He could not face Marcus directly. He could not risk provoking a confrontation that might end in violence or worse. Instead, he remained hidden, watching as the men's movements became more deliberate, their intent clear. They were there to claim what was theirs. The barn seemed to inhale around them, the wind howling through the broken windows like a lament for the past that could not be rewritten. The men's footsteps echoed, a staccato rhythm that matched the beating of Charles's heart. In that moment, the looming danger became undeniable. The sense of impending collapse, both literal and metaphorical, settled over him like a shroud. As Marcus Vale turned to leave, his back to the barn, he paused at the threshold. The wind whipped around him, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decaying wood. He glanced once more toward the hidden corner where Charles had stayed, as if searching for something unseen. His expression was unreadable, but the silence that followed spoke volumes, a threat unspoken, a warning unheeded. Charles remained in his place, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The barn's cracked stone chimney seemed to lean toward him, as if offering an invitation to step into its hollow heart. But he could not, he would not, step forward. He had chosen to watch, to endure, to keep writing as a defiant act against resurfacing trauma. The wind grew louder, the beams creaked more sharply, and the men's boots faded into the distance as they disappeared back into the overgrown fields. Marcus Vale was gone, but his presence lingered like an echo in the hollow walls. In the silence that followed, Charles felt the barn's instability seep into his bones. The danger that had been made undeniable now pressed against him from every angle. He wondered if staying hidden would shield him from the threat, or merely deepen his isolation. Would the silence he chose be enough to protect him from a future where Marcus Vale might return with a bulldozer and a plan? The wind howls through the broken panes of Hollow Creek Barn, turning the dust into a slow, trembling dance that settles over every splintered board and rusted nail. The air tastes of old hay and wet earth, a scent that once promised comfort but now feels like a warning. In the dim interior, light slants from a single cracked window, casting long shadows across the floorboards that creak with each hesitant step. Charles stands in the middle of the barn, his shoulders squared against the chill. He is a man who has learned to move through silence, to let the weight of his own thoughts be the only company he needs. His hands are calloused from years of manual labor, and his eyes, though weary, hold a steadiness that belies the turmoil beneath. Grace appears at the far end of the room, her small frame hunched as if she could disappear into the rafters themselves. Her hair is tangled with strands of grass, and her fingers tremble around the worn edges of a makeshift blanket. She looks up at Charles, eyes wide and raw, the kind that have seen too much pain to trust easily. A low rumble echoes from outside, a distant siren, reminding him of the violent past that has haunted his nights. The barn's cracked stone chimney groans as if it were about to collapse, mirroring the crumbling walls of his own isolation. Marcus Vale, the developer, stands in the doorway, a silhouette against the fading light. His presence is an unspoken threat, a reminder that every step Charles takes toward connection could be a step toward loss. Grace's gaze fixes on him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She does not speak. Her voice is swallowed by the wind. The obstacle is clear. She confronts him with the memory of abuse, her silence a shield against a world that has always tried to crush her. Her eyes flicker to the scarred wood behind Charles, a reminder of his own hidden wounds. The choice he faces is not an action but a gesture. He steps forward, placing a hand lightly on the back of the chair she sits upon. His palm presses into the worn grain, a quiet promise that he will not let her fall alone in this decaying refuge. He does not speak. Instead, he offers his own story through the simple act of holding her steady. The gesture is small but potent, a physical tether that says, "I am here, and I have survived." The consequence unfurls like a fragile thread pulled taut between them. Grace's shoulders relax just enough for her to breathe again, the tension in her arms easing as she feels the weight of his presence. She does not fully open her mouth, but her eyes soften, revealing a glimpse of trust that has long been locked behind layers of pain. The barn, with its sagging beams and broken windows, seems to hold its breath alongside them, as if the walls themselves are listening. In this moment, the silence that had defined Charles for so long cracks open just enough for something new to seep in, an uncertain but hopeful connection. The wind outside intensifies, rattling the remaining shutters, yet inside a fragile bond forms, laced with trust and tension, a promise that perhaps neither of them has to face their past alone. Would this quiet act of protection be enough to bridge the chasm between two broken souls? The barn's roof sagged like a tired sigh, its boards groaning under an unseen weight. The wind, a restless whisper, rattled the broken windows and carried the scent of damp earth and old hay into the cramped space where Charles stood in the dim glow of a single lantern. Behind him, the door had been forced open by hands that did not belong to this place. The clatter of steel on wood echoed off the walls, a grim reminder that the future was being carved with a different set of tools. Marcus Vale, the developer, stepped into the frame, his boots crunching on broken boards. He wore a look of quiet calculation, eyes sharp as the blade of a knife. His presence turned the air colder, the lantern's flame flickering against the sudden influx of wind that seemed to press the very walls together. The barn, once a sanctuary for Charles's solitude, had become an arena where his past and present collided. Marcus raised a hand, palm open, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of authority. "This is my property now," he said, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. He held up a stack of papers, deeds, permits, contracts, his fingers tapping the edge as if to steady his resolve. The documents were stamped with the city's seal, proof that the land had been sold, reclaimed, and rebranded. His gaze swept over the cracked stone chimney, then back to Charles, who remained motionless, a figure carved from shadow and dust. The obstacle unfolded. Marcus demanded that Charles hand over the barn's deed in front of witnesses, his men, his associates, and the very silence that had been Charles's ally for years. The weight of the papers pressed against Charles's chest like an unseen fist. He could feel every line on the document, each inked promise that now belonged to someone else, a future he could no longer control. Charles's choice emerged from the depths of his haunted past. He stepped forward, the lantern slipping from his hand and clattering onto the floorboards. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a murmur against the wind. "I will not give it to you," he said, the words resonating with a quiet defiance that surprised even him. The firelight danced across his face, revealing lines of old scars, remnants of violence and betrayal that had long been buried beneath layers of silence. He did not ask for mercy. He offered resistance. The consequence unfolded like a slow, inevitable collapse. Marcus's expression hardened, but the presence of Grace, her eyes wide with fear yet shining with an unexpected resolve, shifted something in his demeanor. The men around him shifted uncomfortably, their faces turning from confidence to uncertainty as they watched Charles stand his ground. The barn, once a place of isolation for Charles, now became a crucible where alliances were forged under threat. The tension thickened. The air seemed to pulse with the promise of confrontation. Marcus's hand tightened on the papers, but he could not bring himself to tear them away from Charles without risking an escalation that would endanger everyone in the room. The silence that had once been a shield for Charles was now a battleground where his choice, his willingness to defend the barn fiercely, had become a rallying point. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she watched the exchange, her eyes flickering between the two men. She could feel the heat of the lantern's flame, the tremor of the wind, and the weight of an impending showdown that would test every thread of their fragile bond. The barn, a symbol of false refuge, was now the arena where redemption might be found or lost. The scene ended with a question hanging in the air, sharper than any blade. Could Charles's stand against Marcus Vale become the spark that ignites hope for Grace and his own salvation? The barn's floor groaned under an unseen weight, a low metallic susurrus that seemed to echo from the cracks in the stone chimney. The wind had found its way through broken windows and rattled the boards with a hollow sound like distant drums. Inside, the air was thick with dust motes dancing in slivers of moonlight that slipped past the ragged shutters. A single beam of light, sharp as a blade, cut across the floor where Charles stood. Marcus Vale, the developer, appeared at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dim glow. His hand tightened around a shotgun, its barrel glinting with a cold promise. He stepped forward, each footfall resonating in the hollow wood. The smell of wet sawdust mingled with the sharp scent of gunpowder, an odor that felt like betrayal. The obstacle hung between them, Marcus's intent to seize the barn, his eyes narrowed with calculation, his weapon poised as a threat to both Charles and Grace. The silence was broken only by the soft thud of a distant train, a reminder that outside this ruined refuge, the world moved on, unaware, indifferent. Charles felt the weight of the past pressing against his ribs, a phantom hand that had once been a dagger, yet he did not flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, each foot finding purchase in the splintered floorboards. The beam of light traced his silhouette as he closed the distance between them, the air thickening with anticipation. Choice. Charles lunged. Not out of malice, but from an instinct that had survived a lifetime of violence. He did not aim to kill. He aimed to protect Grace and himself. His body moved with a fluid inevitability born of years spent wrestling with his own demons. The shotgun, heavy in Marcus's grip, trembled as Charles's arm wrapped around the handle with a grip as firm as steel. The impact was immediate and brutal. The barrel clanged against the wood, splintering the floorboards like a scream cut off mid-note. Sparks flew from the metal as it struck the grain of timber, igniting a small flare that leapt up toward the cracked chimney. Marcus staggered back, his face contorted in shock and anger, the shotgun slipping from his grasp. Consequence: the barn shuddered as beams fractured under the sudden force. A cascade of splintered wood fell onto the floor, each piece landing with a hollow thud that reverberated through the structure. The sound was a symphony of destruction, metal against timber, dust settling in new patterns. The gun, now free, clattered to the ground and jammed against a warped beam, its barrel no longer a threat. The sudden chaos threw Grace into motion. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, as she watched Charles stand over the fallen shotgun, his chest heaving with exertion. The barn's walls seemed to breathe, groaning as the structure tried to hold itself together against the new weight of broken beams. In that instant, the threat was neutralized, not by lethal force, but by a desperate act of defiance. The barn, once a sanctuary of false safety, became an arena where survival hinged on raw strength and quick thinking. Charles's body bore the strain of his action. Sweat slicked his brow, his muscles burned with effort, yet there was no hint of regret in his eyes. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the scent of burning wood from the distant chimney fire that had already begun to lick at the roof. Sparks danced across the cracked stone, painting the walls in flickering orange. The air tasted metallic and hot, a reminder that the barn's fragile shell was now compromised, its future uncertain. As the dust settled and the echo of splintered timber faded into a low hum, Marcus stood motionless, his shotgun still jammed against a beam. He stared at Charles with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect, as if recognizing that this man had chosen to fight not for power, but for protection, a choice that had shattered more than just wood. Grace's hand hovered near her belly, the unborn child inside her trembling like a leaf in a storm. The barn's walls seemed to close in around them, yet in that collapse there was an opening, an opportunity for renewal, for something new to grow where dust once settled. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The barn's timbers groaned like a wounded animal as the wind rattled its broken windows, each shudder a whisper of the past that had been buried beneath peeling paint and sagging beams. The sky above was bruised with late afternoon clouds, their edges smudged by the distant storm that seemed to gather just for this place. In the middle of that chaos, a sudden crack tore through the silence, a sound as sharp as a knife. It came from the upper level, where a stack of old crates had been leaning too close to the cracked stone chimney. The heat rose in spirals, black smoke curling up into the sky like a serpent. A small fire had begun, its orange glow licking the warped wood and spreading with reckless abandon. Sparks danced across the floorboards, finding their way into every crevice, turning the once quiet barn into an inferno of desperate light. Grace's scream cut through the crackling blaze. Her voice was thin, strained, a thread pulled taut between terror and hope. She clutched her belly as if it were a fragile bird winged with unborn life, the weight of that child pressing against her ribs in a way that made every breath feel like an act of defiance. Charles stood beneath the beam where the fire had started, his eyes fixed on the orange heart that devoured the barn's bones. He felt the heat seep into his skin, a searing reminder that the structure he had chosen as a refuge was itself collapsing around him. The walls, once a promise of shelter, were now a wall of flame. Marcus Vale, the developer, stood at the threshold of the doorway, his silhouette framed by the infernal glow. He watched with a cold calculation, his eyes flicking between Charles and Grace, measuring the threat he had brought into this place. The fire was a weapon that could be turned against him. It could also be used to protect those who dared stay. The obstacle lay in the blaze itself, an uncontrollable force that threatened not only the barn, but the life within Grace's womb. It was a choice that would separate the man from the myth he had built around himself. Either let the fire consume everything, or risk his own life to save another. Charles took a step forward, his hand reaching out instinctively for the nearest wooden beam. The heat licked at his fingertips, but he did not flinch. He remembered the weight of his own past, shadows that had once haunted him like ghosts in the night, and realized that this was a chance to rewrite that narrative. In one breath, he pulled the beam down, sending it crashing onto the floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the barn's hollow bones. The fire screamed as the wood fell, the splintering timber catching flame and then sputtering out as the beam struck a dry patch of hay. The inferno hiccuped, momentarily stilled by the sudden obstruction. Charles used the brief lull to move towards Grace, his muscles burning with effort but his resolve unbroken. He reached her in the doorway, his hand gripping her arm so hard it left a bruise on his palm. "Hold on," he whispered, voice low and steady despite the crackling fire behind them. He lifted her up, carrying her over the splintered floorboards that still hummed with residual heat. Each step was a gamble, each breath was a prayer. As they crossed to the other side of the barn, the flame roared again, licking at the back of their shoulders. The air smelled of smoke and burning wood, choking them as they moved faster. Charles could feel the heat against his face, the ember-strewn wind whipping through his hair like a living thing eager to consume him. When they finally reached the outer door, the fire had already breached the wooden frame, flames licking at the hinges. Marcus Vale's voice cut through the roar. "You can't just run away." He stepped forward, his gun aimed at Charles, but the inferno was already closing in on him as well. The choice crystallized: stand and fight, or flee and leave Grace to her fate. Charles turned, eyes meeting Marcus's. "I'm not running," he said simply. His voice was raw with fear, yet steadied by an unspoken promise. He stepped forward into the blaze, each step a sacrifice of his own safety for the unborn child that clung to Grace's belly like a fragile hope. The heat enveloped him, burning through his clothes, searing his skin. The flames kissed his face, but he did not falter. He reached out, pulling Grace closer as the fire clawed at his back. His body became a shield, a living barrier between the inferno and the life that was still unborn. The barn's structure groaned under the pressure of the flames. Beams twisted, wood cracked, and the stone chimney creaked in protest. The fire spread like a ravenous beast, consuming every inch of timber it touched. Yet Charles held steady, his arms wrapped around Grace, his breath ragged but determined. He could feel the heat on his chest, the smoke thickening with each exhale, yet he pressed forward. In that moment, the barn's walls, once symbols of false refuge, turned into a testament to sacrifice. The fire tore through the structure, but Charles's resolve became the ember that kept Grace alive. The flames danced around them, licking at his hair, searing his fingertips, but they could not touch the life within her womb. When the last beam collapsed under the heat, the barn's roof gave way and a torrent of fire poured over the two figures. Charles felt the weight of his own mortality as he pressed Grace into the doorway, pulling her out of the furnace before the flames could engulf them both. The door burst open, letting in a rush of cold air that extinguished some of the flames, but left others to burn on. The barn crumbled behind them, its walls collapsing, its beams splintering, the roof falling like a stone curtain. Smoke filled the air, thick and bitter, as the once strong structure became nothing more than ash and broken timber. Yet in that chaos, a new light flickered. Grace's breathing steadied, her fingers tightening around Charles's hand as if to anchor themselves to something solid. The consequence was clear. The barn, their false refuge, had burned away. The fire had taken its place, consuming the walls that once promised safety. But amid the ruin, a fragile hope remained. The unborn child within Grace, the promise of new life that would rise from the ashes. Charles's sacrifice had bought them time, a chance to rebuild in a world that now seemed less hostile, because he had chosen to stand against it. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The barn's sagging beams groaned like a dying heart. Smoke curled from the charred roof, turning the once white stone chimney into a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. In that fleeting twilight, Charles stood at the threshold of a ruin he had promised himself would never be his refuge again. Marcus Vale, the developer, paced the cracked floorboards with the calm certainty of a man who believed he owned every breath within those walls. His eyes, cold and unblinking, flicked from Charles to Grace as if measuring their worth against some invisible ledger. The air between them was thick with ash, the scent of burnt timber mingling with the faint, sweet perfume that clung stubbornly to Grace's damp hair. The obstacle lay not in a physical barricade, but in the final, unspoken ultimatum that hung like a spectre above their heads. Marcus had one last warning, a command that could crush the fragile hope they had clawed together from the ashes. He raised his voice, low and resonant. "You've taken what you think is mine. If you don't hand it over now, I'll make sure this barn burns forever." Charles felt a cold surge of panic ripple through his veins, but beneath that fear burned an ember he had carried since the night he'd walked away from a life that had never been his. He remembered the weight of guilt that pressed against his chest, the way it had twisted his thoughts into something monstrous. Yet here, in this crumbling sanctuary, he could not let that darkness consume him again. He stepped forward. The wood beneath his boots cracked, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. He did not raise his hands or speak a single word. Instead, he placed himself between Marcus and Grace as if his body were a living shield. His chest rose with each breath, his shoulders squared against the inevitable. Marcus stared at him, then turned to Grace, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that the man before him was not merely a threat, but a force capable of change. He could have pulled the trigger, could have let the barn's last ember lick its walls, but he did not. Instead, he raised his gun and aimed it at Charles, the barrel glinting with the promise of death. The choice that hung in the air was stark. Charles could retreat, let Marcus claim victory over the barn and over himself, or he could stand as a living barricade, offering his own life to shield Grace from the inevitable. He chose the latter. With a resolve that steadied him like a lighthouse amid stormy seas, he lowered his head, letting the weight of the gun press against his sternum. The consequence unfolded in an instant. The barrel's muzzle met the back of Charles's shoulder. A sharp crack echoed through the silent night as the shot rang true. Blood blossomed across his chest, staining the cracked floorboards with a crimson testament to sacrifice. Marcus stepped back, eyes wide with shock, as the sound of the gunshot reverberated against the walls, a sonic reminder that life could be snatched away in an instant. Grace staggered, her hand clinging to Charles' arm as if she could pull him from the brink. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale a desperate plea for survival. The barn's roof, already compromised by fire, groaned louder, threatening to collapse onto the trio. Charles, his body trembling with shock and the sudden rush of adrenaline, forced himself upright. His gaze met Grace's, an unspoken apology threaded through the look in his eyes. He did not say anything. He simply lifted his arm, steadying her as she clung to him. The fire licked at the beams, sending sparks into the night air like dying embers of a forgotten promise. Marcus, now fully aware of the price he had paid, lowered his gun. His voice trembled. I didn't think it would end like this." He looked at Charles, eyes wet with an unexpected humility that flickered across his face for just a heartbeat before being swallowed by the looming inferno. The consequence of Charles's selfless act rippled through the barn's warped structure. The beam that had once been a pillar of strength now cracked under the weight of his sacrifice, but in its breaking lay a new path, a narrow opening through which Grace could escape. As she slipped past the shattered wood, her small hand grasped at the remnants of Charles' shirt, a physical reminder that he was still there, even as his body succumbed to the flames. The barn's final collapse sounded like a mournful sigh as the roof gave way, sending shards of stone and splintered timber tumbling onto the grass below. The fire roared, consuming the structure that had once been a symbol of false refuge. Yet amid the ruin, a sliver of light pierced through the smoke, a fragile promise of renewal. In the aftermath, with the barn reduced to ashes and the air thick with ash dust, Charles lay motionless on the charred floorboards. His chest heaved in a slow, labored rhythm that matched the dying breath of the fire. Grace stood beside him, her eyes wet, her fingers trembling as she stared at the remnants of his sacrifice. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl?